Welcome back. Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki has criticized neighboring states for not doing enough to help relieve Iraq's massive debts. Over the past 3 years, about half of Iraq's overall $120 billion debt has been written off. The Paris Club, which includes 19 of the world's richest countries, has written off $42 billion. Russia's cancelled $12 billion, and the US is cancelling over $4 billion in debt. But many people are asking, why should all this debt be written off when Iraq has rampant levels of corruption? The former head of the Iraqi Anti-Corruption Committee said that the country has lost more than $18 billion over the last 4 years because of corruption. And more than 3,000 corruption-related cases have been unveiled since the US-led invasion. Well, joining us again now are our guests in Kuwait, Badria Darwish, in London, Sabra Al-Mokhtar, and in Washington, D.C., David Schenker. Sabra Al-Mokhtar in London, let me come first to you for this part of the show, because the US State Department estimates that Iraq still owes an estimated $80 billion in debt. More than half of that is owed to Gulf states. Why should Arab countries write off that debt? Because Iraq isn't a poor country. It has the second largest proven oil reserves in the world.
Well, in the first instance, the so-called debts were imposed by the United Nations under the instruction of the US to these Arab countries. This is number one. Number two, the US now is feeling the economic pinch at home, so it wants to underwrite this financing to the others. So the Americans now are looking for partners in the coast. So they are calling on the Arab countries, one, to forgive the debts, and the second step is going to be to ask them to pay for Iraq. And they are saying that Iraq is a rich country. Iraq is a very rich country, but everybody knows, especially the Americans and their auditing authority, that the stealing which is going on in Iraq by both Iraqis and Americans is beyond imagination. There has never been in history a situation where the finances of a country were raped like the way they have been done in Iraq by both the Americans and the Iraqis who were appointed to be there, like Maliki and his ministers. Look at the Minister of Defense, look at the other ministers, look at the Minister of Electricity. They were even spirited out of Iraq into America. The US is a party to this exercise which is being done in Iraq. Talking about the money in Iraq, yes, of course, but the Americans have decided to give a very high percentage to their people in the north on the basis that they want to divide the finances of the country. This is, again, because the administration is under tremendous national pressure within the USA. It is passing the buck to others.
OK, let's put that point to David Schenker in Washington. David Schenker, the former head of Iraq's Anti-Corruption Committee, says the country has lost a staggering $18 billion in corruption over the last 3 years. So why should Iraq or these countries write off their debts to Iraq?
Well, I think it's a fair question. Iraq is an incredibly corrupt place. Of course, a place like Transparency International would put, maybe a dozen Middle Eastern countries on the list of being extremely corrupt. Never mind that. I think it's endemic in the region. But certainly the conditions are ripe for stealing, and people are doing it. I think also another question would be, that this recent report that Iraqi oil revenues are not being invested necessarily in infrastructure projects in Iraq, but in U.S. Treasury bonds. I think this is incredibly problematic too. The U.S. and the General Accounting Office has looked into this. They've made reports to Congress. It's widely available here. People know about it. They're annoyed about it. I think Arab countries have a good reason to question whether they should fully relieve, Iraq's debt. I think more so that they should be using this as leverage to encourage a type of political reconciliation in Iraq. Maybe debt relief is something that can be done in the future, but I think there are good questions about why that would be done right now. Certainly it would be some form of economic support for the country. More productive, perhaps, would be investment in infrastructure projects themselves. Right now, many Arab countries, particularly in the Gulf, are swimming in cash from the high price of oil. They have funds to invest. The question is whether they will do it. So there's a lot of questions to be asked. I think they're legitimate.
OK, let's bring in Badria Darwish in Kuwait City. Badria, how worried are countries like Kuwait, where you are, which is even still seeking compensation for the 1990 invasion?
The compensation were not put by Kuwait, by the way, by the UN Council. And regarding the debts, money on paper. Kuwait is not right now asking for the money even, or Saudi Arabia. So, and I like what David said in Washington, that we are gaining more money for the, getting more profits for the oil now. So the way is to, it's another way to take the money for Iraq. Iraq doesn't need money. Believe me, in good time, if Iraq decides to build itself, the Arabs will come and help it without Condoleezza Rice coming and demanding that.
Sabra Al-Mokhtar, how significant do you think this issue of debt write-off is, and what role can it play in providing the economic conditions, perhaps, to foster political reconciliation and better security?
Zero. It will have absolutely no effect. The situation in Iraq, we have a clear situation of an occupying force which is not in control of the occupied territories. It has appointed a stooge government there which is not able to stand on its feet. The Americans are pushing the neighbors to come to its aid by saying you have to be part of the political process. They are talking about economics. And all this reference to economic and infrastructure and rebuilding is an absolute hot air. There is no such thing that is being done. There is no infrastructure that is being built by the Americans or the Iraqis when the Americans are there. Iraq was built in 9 months after the 1991 war. But now we have 5 years of occupation with all the money that has been stolen, all the revenues, and there is no sanctions on Iraq, but yet there is not even electricity in the capital of the city. The situation is not money. You can't throw money at problems. It is the existence of the occupation there who has appointed a government which is totally incapable of controlling its own council of ministers, its own parliament, and it's even the green zone is not under their control.
Okay, David Schenker in Washington. Many critics say that Iraq has lots of money and plenty of oil, as our guests are saying, and that it should pay back its debts over time. I mean, do you agree with that?
Well, I think eventually you need some security so they can get back up to full capacity. You know, there is, they do have, you know, proven reserves. So they should be a rich state. They can't have a functioning state, however, without the requisite security, and that's going to require both political political reconciliation and stability for economic development. But it sounds like Sabah is rooting for you know, full-on civil war with American departure. The United States is not engaged in a conspiracy in Iraq. We did not appoint the government of Maliki. The Iraqis had an election. Now the government is problematic, but I'd like to hear what the alternative is. Whether he wants us to leave and have the Iranians have their way.
Well,
Perhaps
let's ask him. Let's put that question to him. Sabah, what's your response to that?
Well, certainly, I want the Americans to leave. The Iranians are there because the Americans put them there, because the Americans allowed them there, because they are giving the protection to a government which they know it is supported by the Americans. The Americans are committing the same mistake by now, arming the so-called Sahwa people. But at the end of the day, the Iraqis, despite all their differences, at the end of the day, they will team up against the Iranians if the Americans leave. The existence of the Americans there make the Iraqis use arms under the pretext of fighting either the Americans or the Iranians.
Okay, Sabah Al-Mokhtar, thank you. We have to leave it there. Sabah Al-Mokhtar in London, Badria Darwish in Kuwait City, and David Schenker in Washington, D.C. Thank you all very much for your time. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We, of course, welcome your suggestions and your comments. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team here, goodbye for now.